Okay, so today's session, what we are discussing is the overview of SBR, so scale-based regulatory framework. Till now, multiple sessions where we have touched upon this concept. Classification क्या होता है, SBR ने ये changes लेके आया, इस हिसाब से here and there we have been touching on this concept. In this circular, what I'm saying, so how is the SBR structured? I will tell you that. SBR is structured in a way. सबसे पहले एक circular, सबसे पहले RBI brought up a discussion paper on SBR. This is the discussion paper. Now that's a very interesting read. That discussion paper, because RBI has in that discussion paper, the entire starting part, they have discussed the importance of NBFCs. There is really good data that they've provided. How important is NBFC sector? Means they have given data where some of the NBFCs, if I am recalling it right, it's at top 7. I'm not very sure on the numbers, but some of the NBFCs in India are so large that they're larger than the cooperative and banks, and so even the banks are smaller than NBFCs. Such large. So today, if I talk about HDFC, Shriram and all, they can actually compete with banks. They're that large. So this gives them, but at the same time, India में around 9,000 NBFCs is the last data I checked. इसमें से मानो, if 10% are functioning, I would be more than happy. Even if 10% are they functioning, rest 90 are actually inactive. And at the same time, inactive. So when I talk about, and उसमें से भी 90 are inactive, उसमें से 10 भी जो active है ना, उसमें से concentration is on the very few NBFCs. अगर आज मैं मार्केट में जाके बात करूं किसी बिजनेस प्लेयर से कि आपको क्या, who has been into this market, lending and all this, और शायद उससे पूछूं, I was in a meeting with a client few days back and I asked him कि, तो he said कि मार्केट में कितने NBFC होंगे, सब MFI वगैरह मिला के 30 या 35. That's what his overview. But in existence, अगर मैं RBI data आज खोल के देखूं, तो there are 9,000 NBFCs. So it's not information asymmetry, it's actually market asymmetry. So I will tell you most of these NBFCs that you mentioned, कि inactive क्या होता है. So these NBFCs were formed around 90s और उस टाइप का टाइम क्या है, जब NBFC license was very easy. Everyone used to get NBFC license. And उस टाइम पे they used to do some activities in that NBFCs, जो अब उतना ज़्यादा possible नहीं है. तो now those activities, NBFCs are inactive. So आज उन NBFCs का दो चीज होता है. One, there is a market जिसमें NBFCs का license के लिए उनका वो होता है. And you know, if I'm acquiring a license, I need to go to RBI to take a change in control application. So we do change in control applications for these NBFCs जो आपस में sell purchase हो रहे होते हैं. So here, when I talk about the regulating NBFCs, it becomes very crucial कि one size fits all approach यहाँ नहीं चलेगा. When I'm talking about the top 7-10 NBFCs, they are similar to banks. So मेरा उनका risk categorization भी banks जैसे होगा. उनका risk to the financial sector is also like banks. So उनका regulations would be equal to banks. But at the same time, there are NBFCs जिनका पूरा asset size bank से profit से भी कम होगा. There are multiple NBFCs that we also deal with जिनका asset size कितना होगा? 100 crores, 200 crores. Now imagine these 100 and 200 crores SBI का शायद round off में भी ना हो. So I cannot apply same regulations to those NBFCs which are such large extent, and at the same time some who are very new to the market, they are catering to a specific niche. I am not saying that the smaller NBFCs are not relevant. They are very relevant. They cater to that relevant niche. Some of them, MFIs, if I talk about, they provide finance to some of the lowest class of India. That finance is very important. MFIs which you talk about, Bangladesh turned around their entire economy using MFI finance. And India, we could not do that. We had some of the crisis in MFI sector, but if MFI sector works, it can do miracles. But why? So they are important. We need to regulate them, but not at the same scale as the larger ones. So, microfinance. So they are very small loans. 2,000, 3,000. गाय खरीदना है, उसका दूध बेच के आएगा पैसा, उससे तुम्हारा लोन चुका दूंगा. That's what microfinance. It's very impactful in economic sense. Now, so जब मैंने तो scale based regulation framework क्या है जो आपकी स्क्रीन पे है ना, ये scale, तो वही हमने क्या, this is actually how India's NBFC sector is bifurcated. Top few are very crucial, very few but very crucial. So उन पे मेरे को बैंक like वो रखना है इसको. At the same applies to upper layer. So this upper layer and top layer, if I'm talking about now, these are very very crucial. Okay. At the same time, when I come to middle layer, number is more, but the relevance is little less. Numbers are बहुत ज़्यादा है, but relevance. Base layer is like very large in number, but almost negligible impact. तो जो ट्राइंगल वहां पे बना है, दैट्स एग्जैक्टली हाउ एनबीएफसी सेक्टर का बाइफर्केशन भी है इंडिया में. हेंस आरबीआई ने रेगुलेशन को भी वैसे ही अलाइन किया. व्हेन आरबीआई अलाइन द रेगुलेशन, उन्होंने वैसे ही अलाइन किया. तो उन्होंने क्या बोला, 4 लेयर्स हमने बनाए. अभी तक हमने बहुत बार सुन लिया है विद इन दिस सेशन, बेस लेयर, मिडिल लेयर, अपर लेयर, टॉप लेयर. हर सेशन में 2 कम से कम 10 बार आता होगा. तो अब उसका एक्चुअल कॉन्सेप्ट बता दो कि व्हाट इज. सो व्हेन आई टॉक अबाउट टॉप लेयर, दिस लेयर एक्चुअली रिमेन्स एम्प्टी. इसमें आज की तारीख में कोई एनबीएफसी नहीं है. It's if the RBI feels कि some NBFC is so crucial that we will actually need enhanced supervisory rule. कि भाई ये तो हमारी बिल्कुल, इसको तो बिल्कुल पास में बैठा के रखे. होता है ना क्लास में बच्चे को बिल्कुल पास में बैठा के रखते हैं कि भाई ये तो बहुत इंपॉर्टेंट है, वैसा. तो if RBI feels कि some NBFC is that crucial that we will need a specific regulatory watch on them because of their criticalness, we will put them under top layer. तो specifically you will be prescribed कि भाई this NBFC is now shifted to top layer. तो आपको टॉप लेयर में आ गए. जनरली कोई एनबीएफसी में होगा नहीं एट दिस स्टेज. करंटली व्हेन यू आर डूइंग द सेशन, अभी कोई भी एनबीएफसी टॉप लेयर में नहीं है. देयर आर 0 एनबीएफसीज इन टॉप लेयर. सेकंड लेयर इज अपर लेयर. नाउ अपर लेयर के लिए आरबीआई ने कुछ रेगुलेशंस प्रिस्क्राइब किए हैं. तो दे हैव गिवन अ डिस्कशन पेपर जब आप पढ़ो या फिर इवन एसबीआर रेगुलेशन पढ़ोगे तो वहां दे हैव गिवन क्राइटेरियाज. देयर आर क्वालिटेटिव क्राइटेरियाज, क्वांटिटेटिव क्राइटेरियाज जो उन्होंने वहां प्रिस्क्राइब किए हैं. उन क्राइटेरियाज के बेसिस पे दे विल जज कि वेदर दिस एंटिटी इज वेरी सिग्निफिकेंट. Asset size is one of them, the riskiness, all those criteria have been prescribed. Basis that criteria, RBI, what the regulations said that RBI would prescribe a list of NBFCs जो upper layer में fall करेंगे. So upper layer would be there. Currently RBI has come out with a list of 16 NBFCs who are classified as upper layer. So those are the NBFCs. They are called bank-like regulations. So these are the very crucial one that I was talking about. These are the NBFCs that are competing with banks. They are so crucial. So उन्होंने बोला कि आपके रेगुलेशन भी बैंक के जैसे. तो there we put it under upper layer. So 16 NBFCs out of 9,000 odd NBFCs in India. Then there is middle layer. Now when I talk about middle layer, these are what we call as systemically important. जो तक हम लोग टर्म यूज, मैं बताया भी था कि systemically important मतलब क्या कि these are the NBFCs. अब अगर एक्सप्लेनेशन में लग रहा है कि अपर के तो नीचे है, but still they are so crucial कि they have an impact on the entire financial sector. So system को आप impact कर सकते हो. आप you are large enough to impact the system. So you are given the middle layer. अब वहां पे मैंने एक टर्म लिखा है arbitrages plugged. Now what does that mean? Arbitrages को हम लोग बोलते हैं regulatory arbitrage का बात किया है. जो आरबीआई ने SBR सेशन रेगुलेशन जब लेके आए, they've talked about a concept called regulatory arbitrage. So what is regulatory arbitrages? कि I act as a bank. Okay, I am operating as at a scale that's equivalent to banks. But my regulations or the regulations that apply to me are for NBFCs. Bank-like operations कर रहा हूँ, but NBFCs का regulation is much more simpler before SBI. For NBFCs, they are much more stricter for banks. But operations bank के level पे कर रहा हूँ, but मेरे regulations क्या है? So this gives a regulatory arbitrage. So that arbitrage is somewhere plug कि जहाँ हमें लगा कि नहीं, these are the things जो आपको करना चाहिए था, आप नहीं कर रहे हो, वो हमने वहां पे लाके ऐप पे लगा दिया. तो मिडिल लेयर के लिए वो दैट्स व्हाट द एंटायर पर्पस ऑफ एनबीएफसी वाज दिस. व्हेन आई टॉक अबाउट इंपॉर्टेंस, सो आरबीआई रियलाइज दिस कि एनबीएफसी इज ग्रोइंग इन इंपॉर्टेंस. वी नीड टू पर्टिकुलरली गिव दिस अटेंशन टू देम और उनका रेगुलेशन पे चेंज का जरूरत है. लेकिन हाँ, स्ट्रिंजेंट से ज्यादा, और एट द सेम टाइम आई एम नॉट सेइंग स्ट्रिंजेंट, क्योंकि इफ आई टॉक अबाउट उन्होंने लिमिट बढ़ा दिया तो मेजॉरिटी ऑफ द एनबीएफसी शिफ्टेड टू बीएल, कई सारे को कम भी कर दिया. सो वो सेग्रीगेशन कि भाई जहां स्ट्रिंजेंट करना है, जिन लोगों का इंपॉर्टेंस है, सिग्निफिकेंस है, उन लोगों को स्ट्रिंजेंट किया, और जहां ईज का जरूरत है उनको ईज आउट किया. बोथ द थिंग्स एट द सेम टाइम, रिलैक्स. सो दैट्स व्हाट स्केल बेस्ड वाज कि भाई तुम्हारा स्केल कितना है, उसके बेस पे हम तुम्हें रेगुलेट करेंगे. ओके, सो एंड देन देयर इज अ बेस लेयर. दीस आर द एनबीएफसीज दैट वी सी की आर द बल्क में. तो आप बेस लेयर, बेसिक कंप्लायंसेस, वेरी लेस फाइलिंग रिक्वायरमेंट्स, वेरी लेस डेटा मेंटेनेंस. मोस्टली हम इन पे रिलाई कर रहे हैं कि आप इतना कुछ सिग्निफिकेंट नहीं है, आप वैसे आप कर रहे हो, करो बिजनेस में. सो दिस इज ओवरव्यू ऑफ एसबीआर. क्लासिफिकेशन क्यों आया, कैसे हुआ, हाउ डज द सेक्टर लुक लाइक, वो एक ओवरव्यू मिल गया होगा. ठीक है, लेट्स मूव ऑन. नाउ आई एम गोइंग स्पेसिफिक टू द रेगुलेशंस. तो सबसे पहले आरबीआई एक सर्कुलर लेके आया, एसबीआर सर्कुलर, जिसके अंदर पूरा लिस्ट डाउन किया कि दीज ऑल थिंग्स वुड कम अंडर एसबीआर. ओके, नाउ दैट सर्कुलर को असिस्ट करते हुए आरबीआई स्पेसिफिक रिक्वायरमेंट्स के रिलेशन में आरबीआई मेंशन दैट सर्कुलर इटसेल्फ कि हम लोग डिटेल सर्कुलर. I'll give an example. जैसे चीफ कंप्लायंस ऑफिसर, तो आरबीआई कि हम लोग कंप्लायंस फ्रेमवर्क से रिलेटेड रेगुलेशंस लेके आएंगे जो इन लोगों जो मिडिल लेयर है उसके ऊपर लगेंगे. So that's given under SBR circular. But फिर RBI brought a separate circular supporting this that details on that specific aspect. So that's how SBR is structured. तो आज जो मैं डिस्कस कर रहा हूँ that I'm discussing on that SBR का main circular, the core SBR circular. Specific circulars maybe in the later sessions कभी होता है, we'll discuss. Okay. One of the major change that SBR brought in was change in NOF requirements. You all know what is NOF requirements. We have discussed in detail. ठीक है, अब NOF requirements में क्या हुआ? सबसे पहले 2 करोड़ का रिक्वायरमेंट था. अब यहाँ पे पूरा चार्ट दिया है कि 2 करोड़ का रिक्वायरमेंट था, उसको बढ़ा so for NBFC P2P AA ICC who do not have public funds and customer interface, उनके लिए हमने नेट ऑन फंड्स को सेम रखा, 2 करोड़ जो पहले था अभी भी 2 करोड़. फॉर अदर NBFCs ICCs और NBFC फैक्टर MFI उसके लिए हमने 10 करोड़ कर दिया, जिनके पहले के दिए वो आप लोग देख सकते हैं. HFCs का 20 करोड़ पहले से ही था, they required 20 करोड़. वो तो we changed, we actually increased this. Main जो increase हुआ actually that's for these NBFC ICCs with customer interface और public fund, उनका वो 2 से बढ़ के 10 हो गया. NBFC फैक्टर जो 5 और 2 हो गया था, 10 हो गया. नॉर्थ ईस्ट वालों को दे, बट स्टिल दे हैव गिवन अ टाइमलाइन. ओवर द टाइम आप लोग को कंप्लाई करना है नेट ऑन फंड्स. नाउ मूविंग ऑन विद स्पेसिफिक रिक्वायरमेंट्स. NOF चेंज हमने डिस्कस किया. देन देयर आर NPA नॉर्म्स. सो NPA आल्सो आई हैव डिस्कस्ड इन डिटेल इन द प्रीवियस सेशन. व्हाट इज NPA? अब NPA के अंदर पहले मैं बताया था कि NSI जो थे, NSI यूज्ड टू कंप्लाई NPA is 180 days or more. And 180 DPD was for NSI, 90 days was for SI. So SI and above, मतलब यहाँ पे जो बाइफिकेशन है ना वो 500 करोड़ से ही है. It's not ML और BL. मतलब हमने ऐसा नहीं बोला कि अगर आप 90 कंप्लाई कर रहे हो तो आप उससे जाके, और जो 180 वाले थे उसको भी सेट कि ओवर द ट्रांजिशन पीरियड नाउ वी विल मूव फ्रॉम 180 to 90. So there will be a at par. Now all the NBFCs will be brought at par. NPA classification would be based on 90 only. So जो एंटिटी, सो इसमें 2 बाइफिकेशन करो. इसमें BLML वाला क्लासिफिकेशन नहीं है, यहाँ 2 है. one of them who were existingly complying with the 90 DPD. तो जो 90 DPD कंप्लाई कर रहे थे कंटिन्यू विद 90. The who was not complying, we have given a timeline. वहाँ पे मेंशन है वो ओवर द पीरियड 90 पे शिफ्ट कर जाओ. Then one requirement that RBI brought in that I think is very good, they appoint at least 1 director with relevant experience of working in NBFC. Now just to give you an additional insight, whenever we went for new NBFC licenses before SBR also, RBI always asked for directors in experience. वो मांगते ही थे कि what are the directors experience, what are they, because your directors are the one running the company. Do they know how NBFCs work? That's very crucial. So they used to ask for it. Now they specifically prescribed it, so it becomes. Then IPO funding के ऊपर सीलिंग लगाया गया. सिंगल IPO सिंगल पर्सन 1 करोड़ से ज्यादा फंड नहीं करो. This came actually near to the time जब एक टाइम था इंडिया में all IPOs were 50 times 100 times oversubscribed. हर IPO लिस्टिंग के ऊपर 50-60% गेन्स दे रहा है. So वो उसी टाइम पे ये रेगुलेशंस भी अराउंड आया था. तो एक्चुअली उसमें RBI रियलाइज कि what that was happening was कि these IPOs are actually funded highly leveraged. Now I will not take name, but one of a so-called startup investor, he posted that he made some IPO, he made some 8 or 9 crores in 15-20 minutes. So what was that? Actually, it was leverage. Now, how did he make such a large amount in such a small time? Was because he's invested a small amount. Rest all was from loan. So when the gains came out, actually his gains got shot up because of the leverage. So actually this leverage was actually pumping the market. So RBI felt a need to control that pumping of the funds into stock exchanges. Hence IPO fund, specifically IPO. Trading up karo, still that's allowed. There are some of the NBFCs that specifically deal only with trading. Most of the broker houses that you see today, all the major broker houses would have their own NBFC to fund their own customer. तब उनके साथ broker account खुलो, तो आपका NBFC उनका खुद का NBFC आपको loan देगा, you can trade with that. So that's it. But IPO funding अगर मैं बात करूँ तो 1 करोड़ पर borrow पर IPO उससे ज्यादा फंड नहीं कर सकते. Max. Irrespective of your asset size, irrespective of your classification, एक बार होगा 1 करोड़ से ऊपर का लोन नहीं देगा. Then there was a new requirement called ICAAP. अब capital regulations के after session discussions में हमने ये term use किया था ICAAP. So ICAAP, just to give an overview, this also came for us. So this requirement for banks. Now this was introduced for ML and upper. So see, under SBR, if any compliance applies to the lower layer, it automatically applies to the upper layer. मतलब BL पे लग रहा है तो ML पे लगेगा ही. ML का, so if compliance is prescribing this is applicable to BL, doesn't mean it's only applicable to BL. It's actually applicable to all. So if it's applicable to M, so wherever SBR is written, this applies to ML. So it's ML and above. That's how it's read. So when I talk about ICAAP, it's applicable ML and above. So what does ICAAP prescribe basically is that the capital I mentioned ना कि capital competition कैसे होता है, you need to maintain capital. तो अब capital के अंदर ना हम लोग बहुत कम risk consider करते हैं. They have said कि आप you do an internal analysis. So हमने एक limit prescribe किया. We said कि आपको 15% maintain करना है. But anyway आप अपना खुद का analysis करो and then determine कि whether the capital that you are maintaining is sufficient or not. So regulatory prescription is then supported by your internal analysis. We'll compare the two and see what's the. So एक internal analysis prescribe किया. You do an internal analysis of yourself. कि भाई हमने तो एक prescribe किया है. But actually see इसका एक logic बहुत simple सा था. Again, the one size doesn't fit all. तो 15% मैंने common पूरे sector को दे दिया. But हो सकता है आपका asset ज़्यादा risky है. So I'm talking about एक personal loan. तो personal loan का risk rate कितना है 100. But even in personal loan that can be differential ना. कोई हो सकता है कि जो 750 plus credit score वाले को lend कर रहा है. कोई हो सकता है कि जो default वाले को lend कर रहा है. There can be different business models. Everyone is doing business, but there can still be differential risk within the same asset class itself. So to address that, आप एक internal assessment करो of your own risk and then determine कि आपको कितना capital का जरूरत है and accordingly. That is ICAAP. So it's full form internal capital adequacy assessment process. Then common equity tier 1 capital of at least 9% was prescribed for NBFCs upper layer. So what is CET? So I will tell you, I talked about tier 1 capital, right? So tier 1 is the good quality capital. Now, अगर tier 1 का भी cream निकाल दो, so that's CET1. That's the creamiest layer. So that's common equity. The most highest quality capital equity. Because tier 1 also covers compulsorily convertible instruments or type की चीज. That doesn't come into common equity. So banks के लिए common equity tier का requirement था. That was bank like regulations के चलते UL पे भी applicable कर दिया गया 9%. So 10% तो minimum आपके ऊपर है ही. 10% is the tier 1 that you have to maintain, of which 9% has to be CET1. That is common equity. So CET1 is actually part of tier 1. Okay. Now
tier 1 का CET tax हो गया.
हाँ 9%. बाकी 1% आप additional जो tier 1 के sources उनसे ले सकते. Then there is leverage limits. Leverage limit. In addition to CRAR, so मैंने बोला था कि leverage CRAR actually restricts मेरे को कितना leverage कर पा रहा हूँ. In addition to that, we have also put in the leverage requirements. So if you all recall, NSI के लिए leverage requirements था, SI के लिए CRAR. So now we can read it as BL के लिए leverage, ML के लिए CRAR. At the same time, when I talk about CICs, का जब मैं session लिया था, that I talked about two terms: adjusted net worth and then again leverage. There were two requirements. 2.5 times of the adjusted net worth से ज़्यादा leverage नहीं कर सकते. At the same time, 30% का वो. यहाँ पे भी actually कुछ ऐसा ही किया है upper layers के लिए. दो requirements है. One is CRAR, at the same time leverage also. Then there is one thing called that is introduced for UL, that is called differential assets, standard asset provisioning. So if you recall the provisioning वाला discussion of us, provisioning में भी discuss की देखो standard अगर एक asset है तो उसका 0.4% करना होगा. For NSI के लिए exactly 0.25 for NSI. अब but again it's the same thing. सारे standard loans अच्छे हैं ये बोलना गलत है. Standard loans में आपस में भी differential है. तो जब provisioning maintain कर रहे हैं, जो provisioning कर रहे हैं, that should also be a little bit diversified. But this again standard provisioning में diversification करना smaller entities के लिए very difficult. ठीक है, that has been prescribed for UL and above. This is a requirement for banks that was extended to UL. Upper layer. BL base layer. ठीक है, ICAAP का पूरा एक स्लाइड में दिया हो, but maybe I will share, you can read on this. Then there is concentration limits. So concentration limits also the one session we had discussed. So पहले क्या होता था actually, two things. First, the concentration limits were linked to owned funds. Now they have been anchored to tier 1, that is net owned funds. ठीक है, पहले owned funds हुआ करता था, अब net owned funds कर दिया उसको. At the same time, पहले दो अलग अलग लिमिट्स हुआ करता था for investment and lending. तो इन्वेस्टमेंट का लिमिट अलग, लेंडिंग का लिमिट अलग. इतना 10, अब दोनों को मर्ज करके एक सिंगल लिमिट दे दिया, क्यूमुलेटिवली इन्वेस्टमेंट प्लस लेंडिंग. अब ज्यादा, क्योंकि इट वाज अ वेरी कॉमन स्ट्रक्चर दैट यूज्ड टू हैपन. अगर मैं किसी को लेंड नहीं कर सकता हूं तो मैं उसके एनसीडीज में इन्वेस्ट कर देता हूं, आज भी होता है. सो आई एम नॉट सेइंग लेंडिंग, बट AIFs आर नॉट अलाउड टू लेंड, but AIFs are allowed to invest in debt securities. So when you talk about multiple AIFs listed out over the, not listed, the private funds, AIFs are not listed actually. These are the private investment funds that act in India, hedge funds. When we talk about their lending, they actually what they do is they structure it as NCD and lend it. So all the private funds, hedge funds, all they do lending. How do they do it? So one of the component of the lending industry is investment funds. Though they are not doing lending, they're doing investing, but that investing is actually lending. Exactly that. And we are fine with it. NCDs are little different than loan. So they are not getting into retail that much. Because AIF won't lend to you. You go to AIF, give me, because you cannot issue NCDs. They are usually dealing with business houses, startups, that kind of investment. Venture debt funds are there. So they have to actually operate in that only. They invest in startup debt. So all that work. UL has to follow this concentration. There is one more thing that's applicable for banks, that's called large exposure framework. That's now applicable to UL. So UL actually becomes, they will comply with large exposure framework. That's, if we go into detailed discussion, I will explain what's the difference between concentration and large exposure. So imagine an entire framework for dealing with large exposures.
So then top layer is nothing there in that.
So top layer actually complies with that, but you come under a specific scrutiny of RBI. So there is no regulation as such for TL. You remain as a TL, and there is no entity also in TL. There is nothing that specifically you have to comply with, but RBI can prescribe you specific. And you see, TL won't be for large. It's not about based on your riskiness. Actually, TL is for entities that might bring in default. Like, let's take an example, a very large NBFC. RBI sees that this NBFC is very near to default. It's doing very bad in business. So I will keep it under my scrutiny. So that's where TL, I think, see, we don't have any precedent till now. It's just SBR. So we don't know where RBI uses it, but that's what the RBI's power is. I think there should be discussion in SBR. I'm not very sure. I will have to also check on this. There should be some discussion around who they will classify under TL. But at the same time, TL is very specific because UL are already regulating at par with banks. It's a very recent framework. So TL, they actually made that layer. When you read the SBR circular also,
there is substantial increase. So RBI classifies it when it is of the opinion that there is a substantial increase in the potential systemic risk from that specific NBFC in the upper layer. So
as I mentioned,
then the NBFC shall move to the top layer from the upper layer.
So top layer बनाया ही इसलिए था खाली रखने के लिए कि जब जरूरत पड़ा तो किसी को उठा के ले आएंगे. ठीक है. Then there is another guidelines that are applicable for sensitive sector exposures. So these are what exposures that are like real estate, commercial real estate, infrastructure. These are the sectors that are very crucial at the same time very sensitive. How real estate, exactly. Real estate lending is one of the riskiest. Entire economies are brought down by real estate lending. There has been a lot of speculation. GFC, entirely based on housing finance. It was not the lending industry that collapsed. It was the housing lending industry that collapsed. Again, but Diwan housing, not very much linked to housing. That's a separate story altogether. You can read on it, but it's actually different. It's not systemic risk. It was not a system. They came into impact of system induced liquidity crisis. That was IL&FS crisis that had a very huge impact on them. But they also had some inherent corporate governance lapses that is being currently under. But that's again a news piece. There are code. We cannot comment on that. So that's it. So sensitive exposures, commercial real estate, capital markets, these are industries जहाँ defaults और ज़्यादा उसका ये capital market not heavily regulated. अब real estate capital मतलब sectors that pose a threat to your lending, like capital markets. If capital markets crash, you won't get your money back. If real estate market crash, you won't. So these are markets that function as a whole, and they are very sensitive to the economy. They are very sensitive to the economy as well. At the same time, they are very sensitive to your lending. So we have to regulate. We cannot restrict them, but at the same time, we have to regulate them. Okay. So that are there are regulations. You need to fix internal limits for it. There have been definitions. You have to make proper disclosures around it so that your investors are properly aware of what exposures you are taking. Then there are regulatory. So then there is another restriction that is being brought on ML. There is a separate circular on this as well. Loans to directors, senior officials, whenever you're lending to. So Companies Act provisions are of course there in place. But in addition to it, there are specific circular for NBFCs that they have to comply for this. Okay. Then there is large exposure framework, as I mentioned, that will be applicable for UL. That's somewhat covers the concentration risk for the upper entities. Now this last limit is again sensitive exposure only, but some sensitive exposures board need to set up the limit. They are not sensitive. Then we are not classifying them sensitive as such. But at the same time, if they are crucial, the board should set the limits for. Risk management committee. Now risk management committee in the corporate governance discussion, I had mentioned that it's applicable to SI. So by that extension, they are automatically applicable to ML and above. But at the same time, SBR framework applies it to all. So risk management committee is actually to be formulated by all the NBFCs through SBR. Okay. Then there is a disclosure requirements that were additionally prescribed under SBR. Disclosure requirements are very important. Look, सबसे lightly disclosure requirements को लेते हैं. It's basically consulting work because consulting work now, but disclosure requirements are very crucial because that actually gives a better understanding of your company to the outside world. You're operating someone else's money. When you're talking about a corporate structure, the very core of the corporate law is that the ones dealing with the money are the ones not whose money it is. पैसा shareholders का है, operate directors कर रहे हैं. Hence, separation of ownership and management. Hence, they are heavily regulated. So here also, there are disclosures around that, specifically related party transaction loans to directors, because there is no sifting of funds or anything like that. There is enhanced requirements for that has been prescribed. Okay, board approved policy for grant, that is fine. Composition, proper mix लेके आओ qualification का, that has been prescribed for UL. But of course, एक director NBFC experience वाला होना चाहिए, वो तो है. And at the same time, when I am talking about fit and proper criteria that I discussed around that, so कई बार अगर आप change in control applications और उसके लिए not change in control, change in management application के लिए जाओगे, तब वहाँ पे भी बहुत scrutiny इस चीज पे रखता है कि you're talking about appointing a director, is it a particular suit for the NBFC sector? And RBI has sometimes given decisions barring certain individuals to access directors for NBFCs. So that's RBI's scrutiny area. Directors are very crucial. This is a major requirement that has come in. No. But see, now again talk about what's nomination committee. Nomination committee is actually a subcommittee of board. They do the analysis. They have that responsibility to do that evaluation. Of course, that's why nomination committee also has requirement to bring in independent directors. क्योंकि अगर एग्जीक्यूटिव का रखा तो हमको पता है क्या करोगे, तो इंडिपेंडेंट लाने का रिक्वायरमेंट भी इसीलिए है नॉमिनेशन, एंड दैट्स व्हाई. बट नॉमिनेशन वेरी क्रूशियल, बट उसके रेगुलेशंस भी है. क्या देखोगे वो भी हम ही बताएंगे, क्योंकि हमें पता है कि अगर आपको वो देखने बोला तो आप कुछ नहीं देखोगे. तो mandatory listing, if you are in upper layer, within 3 years you have to mandatorily list yourself. One of the very major requirement. 16 entities जो prescribe हुए अगले 3 साल में अगर कोई listed है. Sorry, I missed out checking before the session. मेरे को नहीं पता है कि कोई unlisted है या नहीं, but अगर कोई unlisted है तो अभी 3 साल में उसको list करें. इंडिपेंडेंट डायरेक्टर का रिमूवल करोगे तो पहले रिपोर्ट करना टू आरबीआई, दैट्स देयर. वो हम लोग आरओसी को भी वैसे करते ही है. resignation आने के ऊपर independent director we have to report to. Then there was limitations that are on the directorships और उसके ऊपर limitations prescribe किए गए हैं for ML and above. ठीक है, multiple वो नहीं कर सकते. Independent directors are not allowed to be on board of more than 3 NBFCs. There are some additional disclosures in N1 financial statements that was prescribed. Then there is a big requirement of appointment of chief compliance officer. There is a separate circular for the entire chief compliance. That's CR. Chief risk officer. Chief compliance officer. There is a separate circular that prescribes entire regulation around compliance function. Now, this compliance function is actually how does the compliance actually works into your entity. At the same time, it also prescribes requirement of compliance risk assessment, compliance testing. How does your CCO work, its functions, its appointment, its tenure, everything is there. So it's not only about, in the SBR they mentioned CCO, but when you talk about the compliance framework, it was a much broader circle. It talked about multiple things. Then there is compensation guidelines when you're paying compensation, as I mentioned. Now, compensation is also very, I will just explain, give you a brief. Why is compensation such an important aspect? If I link too much of my compensation on a variable side, that is linked to my short-term performance, the senior management is bound to take risky decisions. Senior management would overweigh the short-term interest over long-term, agar unke bonuses are linked to the short-term. So hence there are multiple checks that are being prescribed ताकि long-term के अंदर उनका interest long-term से भी attached रहे. At the same time, the variable pay is not too high. At the same time, if they are found to be defaulting, you have clawback and malice clauses. Okay, कि अगर बाद में पता चला कि you had actually done misdeeds. Very famous name case going on, Chandra Kochar. Malice and clawback clause is going. ICAAP. That's it. So all those things.
Yeah. To be for October 2024-23.
Oh, sorry, it's 23.
23 October is for middle layer and April is for
April. Actually, these slides are actually little old. There's a little old slides. Circular आने के बाद I missed out on updating all of those. मैं एक बार discussion करना चाह रहा था. This gives me a flow, but these slides are actually little dated, not very updated. Because when we discuss specific circular वाला तब हम वहाँ पे फिर भी कर सकते हैं. Other governance then there are other matters on that. One requirement that major came in: if you have more than 10 branches, you need to have a core banking solution. So you need an entire IT setup that can actually link your different branches and work. There is a separate circular for it, prescribing the requirements for it. Okay, so actually here I will take a minute to explain that there are two terms: core banking solution. So this term actually frightened NBFCs because core banking solution is a very heavy software that the banks used. Okay, but actually when the circular came out, they used the term core financial service software, CFSS. So core financial services actually is a small part of CBS. So banks, when I talk to some of the software companies who provide this, I talk to them. So they mentioned that CBS is a very large software that deals with multiple aspects. CFS is a part of it that is more relevant to NBFCs because lending and all those. So they have different modules. How does when I talk about the entire software now, so how does software works? There is not a one large software. There are multiple small softwares that are connected together to act. Like I will tell you, there is one thing called loan management module, LMS. So LMS is actually deals with loans. Okay, then there is a so if you're doing co-lending, there are different plugins available, different functions. Yes. So when I talk about a core banking solution, it's actually accumulation of multiple small modules that are operating treasury, deposits, all those functions coming together and forming one software that's integrated together to act as a core banking solution. So core banking solution is much larger. Actually, CFS is a part of it. All the major development companies that you talk about, they develop these softwares. They also have pay-per-go wala. If you want to use our software, they also provide services for specific modules. You have specific modules, see the modules, le lo, pura software mat lo. Okay, that's for the overview of the regulatory framework for SBR.